this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Welcome to episode 18 of The Endgame, where we discuss race and sports. And today we've got a special guest. We're also going to discuss gender equity in sports, as well as race, with our guest, Susan Shackelford, an author of 2 books. Most poignantly for this episode is Hoops and Heroes on Army women's basketball. And then she's also written a book called Shattering the Glass about women's basketball. But first, let me introduce my co-host, Herman Bowles. Herman has his own distinguished career at Army as a retired colonel, football recruit, first black quarterback at his high school in Alabama, 1973, top businessman in America for JALL in Washington, D.C. And Herman, let's start out by you recapping your recent induction into the Alabama Business Hall of Fame.
Well, Tom, it's so nice to be on the show. And Susan, looking really, really forward to this time spending with you. And Tom, thanks for bringing that up. I'm very, very fortunate that I was inducted into the 2023 class of the Alabama Business Hall of Fame. And it's a program that's run by the University of Alabama. It's quite a distinguished award for a lifetime of service to the ideas of capitalism and business integrity. And what a distinguished group of gentlemen, in this case, gentlemen that I was with. However, last year, Alexis Herman, who we know as the former Secretary of Labor and also a fellow Alabamian, was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So it's great to see Alabama, my home state, look to make sure that we're inclusive and make sure that we recognize the talents of everyone. And Susan, as you hear us more during this show, that's what Tom and I kind of talk about, is equity in all aspects. And I just want to use this moment to say the importance of sports played in my life, preparing me to have this opportunity to be in such a distinguished group of people to get recognized for that award, because it's about perseverance, it's about having a vision, it's about working hard, it's about disappointment, it's about falling down, it's about getting up and doing all of that while at the same time maintaining the ability to get along with your classmates, your teammates, and your coaches. And really, and Susan, I think you would agree with me, that's really what life is about.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah. And then Susan is a pioneer of her own as a women's sports writer. You were the first women's sports editor of the Daily Tar Heel. Is that right, Susan?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And then, of course, you went on to career at Miami and Charlotte. Tell us a little bit about your career, and then also about Hoops and Heroes and Shattering the Glass.
Sure. I started out, as you said, Tom, at the Daily Tar Heel, and the thing that stands out for me, and it's an equity piece that we're talking about today. When I was a freshman, I just kind of begged my way onto the paper, emptying the trash can and doing errands for the established writers. And then they said, "Hey, will you go get these scores from the tennis team, the men's tennis team?" I said, "Sure," So a couple of weeks later, after doing that, I said, "Y'all are busy. Let me write these things up." So they're like, "Oh, okay," and kind of waved me away. Well, before I knew it, I was writing them up for the women's tennis team as well. And as soon as I started covering them, all these other coaches of the women's teams that spring and the following fall, they started coming out of the woodwork. I mean, they would find me, at Woolen Gym and other places and say, "Hey, what about my team?" I mean, this was everything from fencing to swimming, to basketball on. So I started covering as best I could, all of them. And we were able, to get them some ink in the paper. And that to me was one of the best things that I accomplished during my time there. Is from that point on, every beat of a women's team as well as the men's team had a reporter on it, because by the time I was sports editor, I could make that decision and put one person, on every sport. And so it was equity, and trying to give the women, coverage too. So
Yeah,
uh,
and we
yeah,
should add that this was at the beginning of Title IX, so there wasn't anywhere near the awareness there is now of women's
that's right.
sports, and so someone like you had to be there to push it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true.
Well,
Yeah, go
tell us
ahead.
about your books.
Well, the first book that I was a part of is Shattering the Glass. I'm a co-author on that book. It came out in 2005, and it is a history of women's basketball here in the United States. So we cover it from the point, of when it begins, which is for women, which is right after the men. I mean, not hardly any time later that Cinda Berenson started women playing at a college. And so then we come all the way forward. My co-author is Pamela Grundy, and she's a sports historian and former journalist and very talented person. And it was her idea for this book. And she had been looking, she knew there was a gap in the coverage of sports because of her sports historian status, um, about a major women's sport. And she knew basketball had the longest history. So she came to me and said, "Hey, I can't do this alone. I need some help." And so we teamed on it, and took us probably 4 years or so to write it. It came out in 2005. The game was really at a pitch at that point. And then it just kind of, the quality of the game continued, but it kind of flattened out. So we were a little disappointed with the shelf life on the book, just because, and it's that ebb and flow around women's sports that you see, women's basketball. But now we've hit another pitch point in women's basketball, and Pamela and I are now updating the book, and it's supposed to come out in 2025.
Great.
So, yeah.
And then Hoops and Heroes.
Well, Hoops and Heroes is the sort of the love child of a bunch of the team alums of the West Point women's basketball team. They were the primary ones are in the early years of the program. They knew the program had a really rich history. They knew that there was a tightness among many of the players coming all the way through the years, and the bond of playing a sport together at West Point, and on top of it being, a minority group at West Point, made the bond even tighter. So they wanted to get those those stories, down for people to know and have a chance to absorb. So they formed a nonprofit to produce the book, and came to me because of Shattering the Glass, and and some family ties that I have to West Point. And so that's how it was created, and came out this year.
And one of the points that you make in your book is how women's sports helped integrate the academy, because they weren't necessarily welcomed when the first women's class came in what, I think 1976.
Yeah, that's right.
Herman,
Well,
you were a
I
junior
was
then.
there for that, Susan, so
Oh, yeah.
I'll be happy to hear your perspective, but I was on the ground and able to witness that integration.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I'll be interested in some of your thoughts about that. Yeah, it was a rocky start. The women arrived July of '76, and it was a time in our nation, there was a lot being celebrated. There was the bicentennial, women's rights were well underway, but the hierarchy at West Point was against women coming there. And the superintendent at the time, Sid Berry, was blatant about it. He gave a tour to a group of women who, in January of '76, who were planning to come in the summer. And on that tour, shockingly, he told these women they would be admitted over his dead body. Can you imagine what it took for those women to then, enroll there? I mean, they had to have an incredible drive back then to want to do this. And then, there were plenty of people in the military hierarchy who were also opposed to it, like William Westmoreland, who had just led our troops in Vietnam. And he called the whole admission of women silly. So
Yeah, and if we go fast forward now, the military is one of the most diversified institutions in our country. Herman, comment on both the diversification of the military with women and minorities.
Well, let me start with Susan's point about West Point, because I was there at the time. I entered West Point in 1974, and I can remember with such fanfare that even my classmate and the cadets that were there, so against women coming, okay? Tell you what I made that analogy to as a young Black kid from the South. It was discrimination, okay? No reason whatsoever, because they were women. Now, let me tell you what it was, and this is my characterization. I'm not going to mention any names. The people who were most adamant and against it were the men that I think were marginally there to start with. They were trying to do, in my opinion, is to justify their manhood of how tough they were. And do that, they had an opportunity to do it by criticizing women coming in, okay? And again, I felt that discrimination. I spoke up for the women because it was like, you discriminated me just because I'm Black, nothing about what I do. Now, let me tell you both something else, which you probably already know. Susan and I also had a tour where I taught at West Point. After finishing business school at Harvard, I went back to West Point and I taught finance and economics. And let's just look at it from a numbers perspective. Particularly those early women that came in, we were able to pick the cream de la cream de la cream. And on a gender adjusted basis, they were more qualified than the male cadets that we had. And that continued, because I'm going to tell you, when I taught there full time from 1985 to 88, and then I taught in the reserves from 1991 to 2008, I saw this transformation of the women. And I want to tell you something. Some of my best students that I taught were female cadets. And I liken that to the fact that in the admissions process, we had to share our men with, Harvard, Yale, and all these other places, but we had these dedicated women who wanted to serve at all the academies, and they were just so talented and qualified from an academic perspective. And, we had the thing where, women couldn't do the pull-ups, so we had to do the bar. They had to do the timing on the bar. And let me tell you, these women are outstanding. Now, I'm a little biased, Susan, as well, because my wife, the late Iris Bull, she passed away 2.5 years ago. She was a military officer as well. She didn't go to West Point and ended up doing fantastic work, ended up being a presidential nominee, a presidential appointment in the Clinton administration. And she was the number 2 person for personnel for the entire Army.
Oh, wow.
Millions and millions of people. And she did that as a woman. And as we look now as to what is happening in the Army, I have the pleasure of being a member of the Defense Policy Board. And for listeners that aren't familiar with that, it's a group of about 18 Americans who are advisors to the Secretary of Defense on all issues related to the defense of our country. When I joined the board, one of our board members died just 2 weeks ago, and that's Henry Kissinger, okay? Other people who are Ash Carter, former Secretary of Defense, Madeleine Albright, when I joined the board, she was chairwoman of the board, the Defense Policy Board, chaired by Madeleine Albright. The chair of the board right now is a female, Janine Davidson, former Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Navy, and a former pilot in the Air Force. And now she's president of the university out in Denver. So the whole idea that women would not have the opportunity to compete and show what they can do to compete, is ridiculous.
Yeah, and what great stories you have in bringing it all the way through, Herman. I mean, it's really interesting in your perspective from a high level and as well as being a cadet there. One thing from your era when you were a cadet there, a lot of the women and the media and there was a broad acceptance of the fact that the women's basketball team, which was started just months after women got there, and they played a really gritty style. And they got coverage from the New York Times that came up on their first game and just were amazed at how good they were. And there was a guy in the local paper who had the funniest quote, and I've got to read this to you, you know, being a writer. He said, this is David Bushnell, and he said, I bet the farm that any one of the women could take General Grant or General Westmoreland to the hoop with more ease than Sherman took Atlanta. So, I mean, the women, as we were saying earlier, you know, sports are bigger, you know, than themselves and more meaningful, you know, they're about life. And it really made a lot of those naysayers think twice about the women being there. And then a lot of them got won over because of the women's basketball team.
Yeah, and anytime anything in America, race, gender equity, it's never an overnight story. There's always a long list of pioneers marching, clearing the path to today. Of course, when you think about Army, you think about the Army-Navy football game, the best rivalry in college football. Don't let anyone tell you Duke and North Carolina basketball, Dick Vitale, is a bigger rivalry. There's nothing bigger than the Army-Navy game in football. Herman never misses a game. But tell us about how the Army-Navy women's basketball rivalry has grown. And there's a special trophy that goes with it, right, Susan?
There is. It's a crystal trophy that these two ardent fans came up with back in the 1980s. They saw that the women did not have a trophy that went back and forth based on who won the star game. And so they asked about it. And they were named Joe and Frances DeVito.
Susan, why don't we tell our listeners that they played two basketball games and one of them is considered the star game, meaning that's what
Sure.
right. So we play twice and one is designated the star game. And it's usually the last game that you play for the men and the women.
That's exactly right. Yeah, because there are two games, so it's designated.
The other thing is that the letter men and letter women, if you win a star game, you get to put a star on your letter for beating both Navy and Air Force. So just making sure the listeners understand the
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that, Herman, because I know we have a broader audience than just West Point people here. So these brothers, Joe and Frances DeVito from Brooklyn, sort of adopted the team in the mid to late 80s. And they did all kinds of things. They threw tailgates at the football games for the women's basketball team. They bought equipment so the coaches could break down video. They helped upfit a player lounge. They even took the team out. I told you from Brooklyn, when the team would come into the city for a game, they would take them all to dinner at some really nice place. So they asked, where's the trophy? And the coach at the time, Lynn Shavaro, said, well, there is not one. And they said, well, we'd like to get one. And so they got permission from both the Navy and Army athletic director to get a trophy. So their idea of a trophy was to go to Tiffany's in New York and have it made. So that's why it is such an absolutely gorgeous tall crystal trophy with a crystal basketball on top that's actually removable. And in the mid-2000s, somehow that crystal part on the top, the basketball, disappeared, but the Academy replaced it. And so it is still there, you know, proudly being passed back and forth between the two academies.
Yeah, that sounds great. You have chapters on several players and teams and moments in Army basketball, but we're going to talk about one of my all-time favorite athletes from San Diego and one of my heroes beyond that. And the reason that I'm wearing an Army Black Knights t-shirt instead of my usual Michigan State gear. Tell us a story about Dawn Halfacre, Susan.
Well, Dawn's story really puts a spotlight on the fact that the basketball team is a conduit for finding tough women. The academy finds them many ways, but the basketball team identifies them well. And in Dawn's case, it actually helped refine her, the basketball team did. So it had a different an additional level. When she showed up, and it was in 1997 for the reception day, which is the day that all the aspiring cadets come to Mikey Football Stadium and they're ready to be supposedly shouted at and told what to do to get ready to train to be cadets. Well, she showed up with her tan and her Shaka red hair, and she was kind of like, what is this? She really wasn't ready for the climate and culture. So she started to act out. I mean, the very first day there was a run, and everybody just fell in, did the run. She's on the run and she just kind of got bored and she just decided to drop out. Well, her class members later grilled her, as you might imagine. What are you doing dropping out of a run? And she was like, well, what's the big deal? Well, then the next thing you know, she's sneaking off to the movies and gets caught. And then, it reached a real high point in a bad way when they were on a road game that season. She got into a fist fight with one of the opponents. So clearly adjustment problems galore. So the women's basketball community and its leaders and the people that work with the team took her under their wing and helped her. And she learned how to keep her head down without sacrificing who she was. And she said, I think because of that, I became a pretty good Army officer. Well, when she was getting close to graduation, she wanted to go into combat, not an option for women at that time. This was, 2000 and I think it was 2002, 3, early 2000s. And it wouldn't be till 2015 that women could serve in combat roles. So she picked military police because it was the closest to the action, she thought. So when she trains as a military police officer, 9/11 happens during her training. Of course, the whole nation changed. People knew they were probably going to be sent over. She wanted to go. She went. She was sent to Baghdad, first to Kuwait, and then later to right outside Baghdad. And she was a military police officer. And she played basketball and she loved it. It was a great thing, just downtime. She's out on a morning mission in the wee hours of July 19th, 2004. And she's in a Humvee with 2 others, and a rocket-propelled grenade came through the engine and it took out one of the people in the Humvee. The driver was badly injured, so was Dawn. And when she recalled that, she said, I remember thinking something was exploding beside my head. I'm choking on the smell of gunpowder and blinded by the flash. There was a feeling of an amount of pain, like someone is taking an axe and hacking away. Still, she had the presence to order the driver, get us the hell out of here. And somehow that driver, injured as well, got him out. They went back to the police station. She was medevaced out to Germany and put in a medically induced coma. Her injuries were rampant. She woke up 11 days later at Walter Reed and found out the extent of it. She had survived a respiratory infection, bruised lung, 5 broken ribs, and then most tragically, she had lost her right arm and shoulder. They could not save it. And she told me, she said, I thought my life was over, game over. She was so depressed, she told her mom, please cover all the mirrors in my room. I cannot look at myself. And this went on for a while. People were very concerned. And then one day, Danielle Green dropped by her room. Danielle had been a basketball star at Notre Dame. She too had suffered an injury from a rocket-propelled grenade. And the two of them just sat there and talked for a while. Just small talk, just, basketball at Notre Dame, basketball at Army. Then, Danielle left. And, at that point, Dawn started thinking about just what had happened. And her mind began to shift, her emotions began to shift. And she told me, wow, this is amazing. Danielle's working out and talking about what she's going to do in the future and about Notre Dame basketball. I thought, if she can do this, I can. So once again, basketball had come into the picture to help Dawn. She was discharged from the Army, unhappily, but her physical limitations made it necessary. She worked as a volunteer for Wounded Warriors, and then started her own small contractor business, putting her computer science degree to work. And that went well. She liked it. And then she thought a little bit bigger, and she started her own software development firm and started hiring people, hundreds of people, many of them veterans. And they specialized in selling their services to the government, particularly to the VA. So, it was a number of years later, she'd been running on high octane, making a very successful go of it. And she decided, I'm ready for new things. So she decided to sell the company in July of 2021. So she sold it for a cool $250 million in cash. And it was to another woman-owned business there in the DC area who wanted to up her game in working with the VA. So what an ending. She was an amazing person. And I know, Tom, you had the benefit of knowing her in high school.
Yeah. Small world story that we got to know each other. I saw Susan at the Raleigh Sports Club, Herman. I got to take you there one of these days. And I wrote about Dawn. I knew her as early as high school. What I didn't know, because she was such a tough athlete, was the story Susan told earlier about her not being very dedicated. Because I figured she was a slam dunk for West Point. She would just breeze right through it. But give us your comments, Herman, on West Point. Let me say this before you speak, Herman. I've written about Dawn too, and I once asked Dawn, if it's not for 9/11, she goes to the Army to play basketball. If it's not for 9/11 and invading Iraq, she doesn't lose her arm. And I asked her in a story I wrote if she had any regrets about going to West Point, and she told me no, because it made me the person I am. Herman, you take it from there.
Well, first of all, Susan, thanks for capturing that story, because that's grit and determination at its best. And as we think about what West Point is the crucible of leadership development. So you tell the story of this young lady who obviously her attraction to West Point was basketball, right? She's very good at it. She likes to be part of a team. However, she gets there, and there's somewhat of an antidote between what her expectations of what she wanted to be and what it took to be a good cadet, and therefore the foundation for being a great Army officer. And what this is a story of is her ability to, number one, acquiesce to the norms and culture of West Point, while at the same time, and this is important for both minorities, I think, and women, maintaining your individuality and your own identity, right? Because what we don't want to do, I don't want anybody out there listening to do, that's a woman and or a minority, to feel that you have to assimilate and lose your own identity. I mean, I've been very, very successful in business, and it hasn't been by assimilating and trying to guess what people wanted me to say. You have to be yourself. And I think the success that she achieved later in life is definitely an indication that she was herself. She learned what the norms were of what she had to do, became a great teammate, then was inspired to say, I want to be where the action is.
Yeah.
I never served in war. Both of my kids did, who went to West. Two of my sons, Susan, went to West Point. One's still in the Army now. Did 3 tours in combat as an infantry officer. Okay. And the point is, everyone that goes to West Point, you understand that you're ultimately there and you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. You're well trained. You're taught to do what? Take care of your team. And that's why many West Pointers are such great leaders. Because mission first, people always. And she learned that through that process, and her desire, as you say, to want to be where the action is. And she went to that action, had the very, unfortunate maiming incident, while at the same time, you give glory to God. If she had been a foot one way or a foot the other way, she might not have to be here, period. My son on a patrol, one of his soldiers walking in front of him, he saw stepped on a mine. And if you can imagine the trauma that puts to you. So number one, it's somebody that he was accountable for, which he felt really, really bad for. Then number two, they're but for the grace of God. Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
She is this, looks out, and all of those gritty skills she had to become an entrepreneur. The beauty of hers is that she was doing it in terms and having the ability to helping other service members and soldiers and veterans. Did well, and she did good at the same time.
Yeah.
Yes,
Let me
phenomenal American story, in my opinion.
let me tell one more Dawn story and then we'll move on. That story about Dawn yelling, "Get out of the kill zone," that just rings through me. I'm not sure I would have been as brave as she was, and she is a true story. There's the movie Courage Under Fire. That movie. She's a true Courage Under Fire story. And a quick little anecdote. Um, in 2021, Colonel Rick Stanky, a classmate of Herman's and the high school quarterback where I grew up, he and I went to the 2021 Army Wake Forest game, and I'd written a lot about Rollie Stickway, the quarterback who had the great rivalry with Roger Staubach of Navy in the 63, 64 Army Navy games, monumental games. And I arranged to meet with Rollie before the game and introduce him to Colonel Stanky. And but that day he brought Robert Jones, another Army grad football player, who had been in the Hanoi Hilton with John McCain during the Vietnam War. And boy, that was just an awesome moment to meet him. And I sent the picture to Dawn, and Dawn emailed me back and said, "Well, I'm glad you got to meet your hero." And I emailed her back and I said, "Dawn, you're one of my heroes too." So let's move on here. So another chapter you cover pretty heavily and thoroughly, Susan, is about the Proud 16. Explain that story, and then Herman comment on that afterwards, because
I was there.
You have
Sure.
will have insight.
Great.
I know.
Herman, I look forward to hearing your comments. This is what I know about that story from my research and writing, this chapter. The class of 2016 had the largest number of Black women graduates to date, and that was 18 of them. Only 18, but 18. It was the most ever. I mean, it's a lot to be proud of. 2 of those 18 were members of the basketball team, the women's team. Bree Johnson and Bridget Okren, and Sierra Burdick had played a few years on the team as well. Well, the 3 of them joined 13 others, so it was 16 of the 18 Black women who were about to graduate, and to celebrate. And they went over to Nininger Hall and they wanted to do Old Corps photos. This is a tradition, goes back to the 1800s. The people about to graduate come in their uniforms and strike poses and all this. So they wore their dress gray. They had their white collars on that day. They brought their sabers and just had the best time. One of the poses was to throw their fist in the air. Well, later, one of the parents of these cadets posted that picture online and said how proud she was of her daughter graduating the academy. But surprisingly, there was this huge blowback, really a firestorm on social media. And then it spilled over into the national media. And I mean, the New York Times, NPR, CNN, all the major networks. And the firestorm was that some people, including some of these women's classmates, thought the women were supporting Black Lives Matter and expressing political views. Well, expressing political views is clearly prohibited at the academy. Well, the outrage was so high that some of these people pulled their financial support of the academy. So it just was rolling, this thing. The women were shocked. I mean, they had just been celebrating. And when they were asked about it, they likened it to the poses, that cadets take at football games, go Army and this sort of thing. Purely celebratory. And the superintendent at the time was Bob Caslin. And he could see it for what it was and knew it was a celebration, but he also had to deal with the big picture. Dave McGarity could see it for what it was. He was the women's basketball coach. They both let the women know that they understood. Still, West Point conducted an investigation. So when they came out with the results, it said the photo was not a political statement, but that the cadets needed a reminder. They needed to be reminded about perception versus reality. So Bob Caslin and his leadership team proposed bringing in Lieutenant General Nadja West, who was, I believe, Herman, the first Black woman to make Lieutenant General, if I'm remembering right.
Surgeon General of the Army.
Exactly. And then I meant Lieutenant General. She made Lieutenant General, but she also was Surgeon General and the first to do that, Black woman, and that was under President Obama. Well, the women were happy to hear what Nadja West had to say to them, and they were just so pleased that she would take the time to come there. And they learned what they were supposed to learn. But what I loved about this story was really the last statement that was made about the whole thing was the fact that these women ordered T-shirts that say the Proud 16, and they wear those, as it says, with pride. So what I mean, I just can't imagine being there in the midst of that. Maybe Herman, you can tell us about that.
Well, I had a close and upfront picture. I'm on the board of our Association of Graduates. I'm currently vice chair, and at the time I was probably chair of the audit committee, but I was on the board. And Bob Caslin and I played football together.
Oh.
He graduated in 1975, and I was 78, so knew him from that experience. And he had been commandant of cadets earlier, and I've been on the board there quite some time, and obviously have an opportunity to interact with our senior officials. And to your point that donors were taking their money back, let me tell you something how that works in reality. The people that talk and say the most, they often give the less. Something that I'm obviously I'm not going to call any names. However, anytime something comes up, I'm on the board of the American Red Cross as well, and obviously I'm on the National Board of Governors there, and it's generally those individuals who have a lot of time They want to make a fuss in some way, and they're generally not significant donors. So I'm going to give you a little insight there. They were donors, okay, but they're not significant donors, because I have the opinion that people that are very, very successful and have the ability to be significant donors, they're successful because they're open-minded and they have the ability to apply that open-mindedness throughout their career. So that's just a supposition of mine. As far as Bob Caslen goes, I personally met with Bob on this issue, and I will not reveal the specific contents of our conversation. However, he had quite a decision to make. He's being bombarded on both sides, right?
Right.
This small minority, which was very loud in their protesting of Black Lives Matter. Of course, all lives matter, but Black lives do matter. Okay.
Sure.
And it become a political hot potato and a very unsolvable social issue. And he's sitting there going one way or the other. And you can imagine my counsel to him was to look at this in a much broader sense. And, the next day, we show a picture of Coach Monken, the football coach. He's leading the team on he leads with what? A fifth.
Right. Right.
So, you score a touchdown, you score a basket. But a guy makes a 3-pointer in the basketball game. What does he do, or she? Yes. Yes. So yes, there's interpretation. Yes, you can make it into whatever you wanted to make it in. And yes, the ladies needed to be aware of the sensitivity, particularly during the time that we're in our nation. When this matter was there. The nation should be aware of the pride that these women had, okay? And look, I tell you, I only had one incident back in the 70s at West Point that I thought was racially motivated. One event after my 4 years there. Were people hard on me? Yes. Did they fuss at me? Yes. But they fuss at everybody. I'm certain there is some prejudice there. I personally did not experience in the 70s. I was on the staff there for 20-something years teaching. I certainly didn't see it in any way. Well, there was one professor, and if I named the name, you guys would know him, but I'm not going to do that. That probably had some Nazi leanings. But other than that, it was just phenomenally what we call meritocracy, right? Where you go, again, I'm a country boy from Alabama. I came there, I didn't know anybody in the military, I didn't know anybody. And that place is such a melting pot for taking people who have an ability to give, and you receive so much from that experience. So I'm glad that it turned out the way it did. It was a learning exercise for everyone. And those young ladies are out serving both our country and in civilian and business organizations very, very honorably now.
Yeah, and I think a good comparison for that, the current issue of Sports Illustrated has Deion Sanders as the Sportsman of the Year, and a lot of people were upset about that because the team was only 4-8, and Deion is a very flashy guy. He's not the traditional football coach. He's not a Woody Hayes or Bo Schembechler, thank God. But in the Sports Illustrated story, it's very interesting. It's written by Pat Forty, and he makes the point that the country has evolved to a black coach like Deion, or has to evolve to that, rather than Deion evolving to be a Woody Hayes or a Bo Schembechler. And I just thought that was a very interesting perspective and very similar to this story. We have to be a country that's continually evolving and examining and marching forward. Let's move on and talk about another fascinating chapter, Maggie Dixon.
Yes, many of you out there may have heard of Maggie. She was in her first year as head coach at West Point when she really attained a lot of national attention. The team, when she came in, was in turmoil because their coach had just left suddenly. And it was like the end of September, something like that. They did a quick search. They even involved the seniors in helping pick the replacement, and they all were for Maggie. They did interviews. So they really quickly identified this was a special person. And when she arrived, she had less than a month to get them ready for a game. But she had a lot of buy-in because all the players felt like they were starting from scratch, and they could, everybody could give their best effort and be evaluated. There were no preconceived notions. So they got going. The effort was tremendous. Maggie was only 28 years old. She had a very famous basketball coaching brother, Jamie Dixon. Y'all may know his name. I think he's down in Texas now. I think he's at TCU. Is that right?
Correct.
He was-
I think,
Longtime pick coach.
He was,
yeah. Yeah, and Maggie had been at DePaul coaching under Doug Bruno, who is a longtime women's basketball coach, very successful. So, the team under Maggie, when she came to West Point, had some hard times. They had to get themselves together. They had to figure everything out. So before Christmas was pretty rough. They didn't win. They might have won a game or two, but they all held their ground. They did not slip. They just kept working. And then the switch flipped in January in the Patriot League season. They started 5-7 in the Patriot League season and then only lost 3 games in the league after that. And the thing that was so remarkable, when the games were close, and there were 6 of them, by 4 points or fewer, they won them. So there was something clearly special about this group. And one of those close games was right at the wire of winning the Patriot League title. And it was a remarkable finish. It was a 1-point win. And with that came the birth to the NCAA tournament, a first for Army women's basketball. Well, everybody knew the stakes that night. They were playing on the floor there at West Point, and the cadets, the male cadets, came pouring out of the stands after the game. They hoisted Maggie up on their shoulders. I mean, she was dressed in her suit and her heels, and they carried her around the court. And some of this was captured on and played on national television. And it was an exhilarating time. And a quote I'll never forget when I was doing my research, Bob Beretta was a longtime sports information director at West Point. And this is what he told me. He said, in the microcosm, what this academy stands for is you face adversity and continue to plow through. And here it was. So he could see it in that game. The giddiness of the victory continued until the night they drew Tennessee in the selection show, but still they were pretty excited. I mean, who wouldn't want to go against the best? So they went down to Norfolk, played Tennessee tight for most of the first half, brought out the ire in Pat Summitt. She read her team the riot act at halftime and said, "What are you doing letting a mid-major school, do this?" So the fire was lit. The Lady Vols, surged ahead in the second half and put an exclamation point on it when I think Candace had maybe even done one in the first half. She had 2 dunks in that game, Candace Parker, which many of you remember the caliber of player she is. So given Maggie's remarkable success, when she went to the Final Four that year, even though the team wasn't playing, her ability to rally this group and lead them, to your point, Herman, about leadership, that was the talk of the Final Four. West Point was afraid they weren't going to be able to keep her. And she assured them, "No, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Well, she was about to go on a recruiting trip naturally in the spring, and she dropped by a friend's house to just have tea one afternoon, and she started feeling bad, and she suddenly just passed out. It was, and she did not like snap to, and so her friend called the medics right away. She went to the hospital and then went to a larger hospital, was shipped there, with probably, I think, by helicopter. And she never came out. I mean, she was in a coma and she had had a heart attack. The family, the Dixon family, was faced with the most excruciating decision of she wasn't going to get better. So they had to decide, do they take her off life support? And they did. The team and all West Point officials were beyond grief. They flew out to California for her funeral and then offered that if the Dixon family wanted Maggie to be buried at West Point, they would welcome that. The family thought about it a while and they realized the true heart and the true leadership of who Maggie was right there. Even though her parents and her sister lived in California and Jamie was not at West Point, they decided to have the burial at West Point. And she is buried among generals and sports heroes, including the 1946 Heisman Trophy winner, Glenn Davis. That team was an amazing team. And Ashley Magnani was a senior that year, and she told ESPN this: Maggie took a group of players who had hidden talent and just didn't know it, who didn't believe in themselves, and she made us feel like we could fly, and we did.
Great. Herman?
Well, had the opportunity to meet her and Susan to observe and experience that magical season. Kevin Anderson was the athletic director. He's a good personal friend of mine, and made the decision to bring her on. And just the her legacy at West Point, we hope to live forever. They've named a couple of awards after her.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that as young as she was, and Kevin recognized her ability to motivate and inspire, and that's what leaders do. And her players came together for her, and I gotta tell you, that's just one of those kind of made for TV movie type things.
Mm-hmm.
And her extraordinary skills to bring that group of women together. And of course, the Tennessee game, believe me, I watched it. And
Yeah, I did too.
it could have, like most of the time when we were against those big schools, kind of like us against Indiana, Tom, this year in basketball. We hang in there for a while, and Michigan and Oklahoma in football, we hung in there, took them both to overtime. It's just something about these cadets and their ability. And it's sort of like Coach Monken says all the time, you don't have a lot of 5-star. I don't have any 5 stars in this locker room. Okay. They're guys that play the game because they guys and gals. Now when we talk about the basketball team, they play the game because they love it. And those are the type of people that we have at West Point. Those are the type of coaches and instructors and leaders we have at West Point. So this ability to bring all of these ingredients together to create what I think is the best leadership institution in the world.
Okay, well, let's finish up with a couple of Coach K stories. One of them, Herman, you're going to have to ask Coach K about later for more comment. The first one was about Coach K not allowing the fans in from the cold because he had practice going on. And then the second one is about Coach K and the great Kelsey Minato, a great women's basketball player, AP Associated Press honorable mention All-American in 2016, had her number retired, and Coach K officiated a shooting contest between her and Steph Curry when Coach K had the Olympic team practice at West Point. Tell us the Coach K closing the gym story first, Susan.
Well, this was 1977, 78. So it'd been your senior year, right, Herman?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the women's basketball team had their first basketball recruits that year. It was a big game. They had over 3,000 tickets sold. And Jim Peterson, who had founded the program from within the PE department, because the athletic department didn't really have any interest in doing that anytime soon, he perceived. And I think he was right. There were several things that bore that out. And so he had decided this was a great opponent, Princeton. They had an established program. Let's have a big women's basketball day. They called it High School Women's Basketball Day. That was the billing. Sold all those tickets, and he got the provision that the fans on this cold January day could get in an hour early. So they show up an hour early, and Coach K says, no, he's still practicing with his team. It was a pretty harsh evaluation, but he was in his third year at Army. I mean, he's a young coach. It's his first head coaching job. He's a former cadet. He played there under Bob Knight, and he just said no. So they stood outside in the cold, and then came in. They were allowed in 30 minutes before the game. So once the men had cleared out.
So that would be out in the that would have been out in the old field house.
That's correct. It was. And the women generally did not play there. They usually played in Central Gym.
Played in Central Gym.
But because this was such a big game, they moved it to the field house.
Yeah.
So that's the way it was. Yeah.
And Coach K's three daughters were very young at the time. Today, he might have a different attitude about women's basketball. Now, tell us the Kelsey Minato story. Kelsey was such a great player.
Yeah, Kelsey was really a star. And, as you said, an honorable All-American by the time she finished, which, for a West Pointer is really high cotton. The interesting thing about her is she barely made it into West Point in her class, 2016. The Congress had cut the number they could admit, plus she decided late. And so the combination, she decided in March of the year she was to arrive in July. So her parents were like frantically calling, is she going to get in? Is she going to get in? And blah, blah, blah. She was among the last 4 that year that got in, to what would be the class of 2016. She was a very modest, she is still modest, introverted player. She had to be encouraged to shoot more. After they saw what she could do, she had been such a star down at Huntington Beach High School in Southern California. The coaches knew. And then when she was a freshman, she could light it up from anywhere. Plus, she was a great passer. So as Amy Ortner, her teammate, said, our offense became get the ball to Kelsey. So they were all on board. They thought that was, and she rode that out. And all 4 years that Kelsey was there, along with her teammates, they were a strong bunch that Coach McGarity, the head coach, said sort of came out of nowhere. They had no idea they could be so formidable. They had more than 20 wins all 4 of those years. Minato herself scored 49 points one time against Holy Cross, which is an incredibly strong program. When she was a senior, her jersey was retired. When you think, well, of course it would be retired. Well, they retired it when she was still an active player.
Yeah.
There were still 2 more games to play. It was senior night, and they surprised her and the rest of the team. And then they also put a banner up for the whole class of 2016, which is the winningest class in the history of the program. And they raised those banners that night, and I'm sure there weren't any dry eyes there. And she's an amazing player. And so it was going into her junior year that Coach K brought his USA men's basketball team to West Point for an exhibition and some practice. And unbeknown to Kelsey and to Steph Curry, Coach K decided, hey, let's have a shooting contest between these two. So he called them over and it checked in with them briefly and then announced it, said the first to 15 is the winner, sent them down on opposite ends of the court and said, go at it. So they did. And Kelsey made 5 baskets and she's like, oh man, I've done it. I'm at 15. And then somebody quickly told her, no, it's 15 baskets, not 15 points. So she hurriedly gets back in there, keeps shooting. And then finally, when Steph gets his 15, he got it first. She had 12, pretty darn good, given that lull in there. And then Coach K speaks into the microphone and he says, well, really, Kelsey won this because I saw that Steph stepped over the line 5 times. So the crowd, I mean, through this whole shooting contest, through the end, I mean, they had the most fun.
Herman, you have to ask Coach K about that.
Yeah, well, and Susan, just for your information, when I was at West Point, I played football for 2 years and I was a DJ on a radio station. And for my last 2 years, I became the voice of Army sports. And I followed that young Coach K, who called me up to ask to be on my radio show.
Oh, interesting.
I was basically a play-by-play announcer for 2 years, traveled with the team, his young daughters. Back then, we weren't traveling by a jet. We were traveling by a bus going to St. John's and everywhere around the MEAC and Tom understands the MEAC conference. So and I have the privilege of serving on the Coach K Center of Leadership and Ethics at Duke, where at the business school there, where 2 of my sons, by the way, also graduated. So it's a
wonderful,
great connection.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to tell a real quick story, and then Susan, you tell us about how to buy the books, and then Herman, you make the final comment. My real quick story I thought about during our show was when I was doing a story on Kelvin Hopkins, and I went down to Fort Bragg, which is now Fort Liberty, and it's about how, again, about the diversity of the military, and a lot of kids from a tough background can change the trajectory of their life and their family's life without having to be a first-round draft pick in pro sports. And there was Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty is where the 82nd Airborne is, and they were doing a drop that day. All the everybody was parachuting out of the planes, and Kelvin was there for the training. He didn't jump out of a plane, but he was there for a week of training. And so I got to talk, a lot of the old timers were there. They had kind of a reunion. And one of the old timers was telling me about the first women that were on the 82nd Airborne.
Oh.
And their sergeant or whoever it was, a platoon leader, he would slap all the soldiers on the back, but the woman, he'd slap her on the rear end and especially hard.
Ooh.
She got kind of tired of that. So one day she put a flat rock in her pants in the back. And the sergeant or whoever slapped her hard and about broke his hand. So she got her message across that way. That's such a great story. Susan, tell us about how to buy your books. Herman, give us your final comments on the episode.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tom. The Hoops and Heroes book, you'll be able to get by going to hoopsandheroesbook.org. This is a site set up by the nonprofit. So any revenues over, our costs, go to the women's basketball program. And then the other book was Shattering the Glass. UNC Press is going to do our new edition. They also did our paperback edition from the earlier edition. So UNC Press is a really good source that you can get the book. You can also get it from Amazon, and you'll see 2 different covers. You'll see a hardback cover and a softback cover. Thanks, and I welcome any input about what people read. If you can find me on Facebook or contact these guys, and I'd be happy to entertain any kind of thoughts.
Well, Susan, I got to tell you, it was a pleasure to meet you, and you've obviously spent a lot of time at a place that's very important and dear to me, and that's West Point. And you've had an opportunity to meet a lot of the people, and in a sense, you've had an opportunity with your great writing skills to influence even other people to come there. So I want to thank you for your commitment to West Point. Tom and I have so much fun doing this. And having you as our first female guest is also important. I think, Tom, we can look around and try to do that more often. And what you did at UNC, being that first sports editor, I've been kind of the first and the only a few times. And I don't know exactly how you feel, but I certainly know that you had to, carry your weight. Obviously, did it very successfully, and here you are now. So I want to thank you for taking your time to be on the show. And Tom, as always, you're just a great American for the things that you do to raise the level of discussion about important subjects related to race, equity, and inclusion in our nation. Thank you, and have a great holiday season.
Yeah, thank you, Herman. And two of my books are now finally available. This is my children's book about the Underground Railroad that Duffy Doherty and Bubba Smith's father, Willie Ray Smith, he was the chief engineer. Michigan State's college football Underground Railroad changed the face of college football. And in my other book, which you can see here in the background, The Right Thing to Do, that is now available from August Publications. And the first pre-orders have gone out in the mail this weekend. So thanks for watching episode 18. Please share this video with any and all friends.